Beijing's true intentions revealed in a speech, and experts suggest the real motivation behind a Chinese diplomat's outburst during China's first in-person meeting with the Biden administration. Tit-for-tat sanctions between China and the European Union. Beijing seemingly takes revenge over European sanctions imposed over human rights abuse in Xinjiang. Communist China takes new action in the South China Sea. Beijing sends over 200 vessels into waters claimed by the Philippines. The Pentagon comments on China's military. A top defense official says the U.S. must approach China as the country's primary challenge. That's as Beijing continues to boost its military and shows a willingness to take risks. And public outcry erupts over calls for special privileges. Extra luxuries are usually reserved for China's high-ranking officials, but now a few claiming to be relatives of China's elites are making demands. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Following the first high-level meeting between China and the U.S. under Biden, debate is still sparking over why the Chinese diplomats behaved the way they did. One expert says Beijing's diplomat is actually trying to tell the world an important message about his boss's dark ambitions. NTD's Juliet Song has the details.
How did the talks go?
Discussions are hot following the first showdown between the Biden administration and Beijing. Top diplomats from both sides had their first in-person meeting last week. But people are still talking about what's behind some unexpected behavior from the Chinese Communist Party's or CCP's side. Prior to the meeting, both sides had agreed on 2-minute-long opening remarks. The U.S. side acted as planned, but top Chinese diplomat Yang Jiechi broke the deal, going on a 16-minute-long monologue and aggressively throwing out accusations toward the U.S. One interpretation being passed around suggests China was putting on a show for its domestic audience. That way, the regime officials would be praised back at home for humiliating the U.S. But a China expert holds a different view.
He's using this opportunity, an opportunity where he held the world's attention, to share a message from the Chinese leader. So what's the core message? The message is that the Chinese Communist Party will stop recognizing that the U.S. is the world's leader, and that the CCP also won't follow international rules laid out by the U.S. On top of this, the CCP will promote its own values and directives around the world.
Tang says one section of the Chinese diplomat's long speech is particularly telling. In it, Yang said, the U.S. does not represent the world. It only represents the government of the United States. The Chinese diplomat went on to say that neither the U.S. nor the West represent the international opinion. He later added that he thinks a number of countries don't agree with American values or recognize the U.S. as a global leader. The diplomat also stressed one point, that China follows the international order set by the United Nations.
But many of the key organs of the United Nations and many of their critical policies are controlled by the CCP.
Tang says the diplomat's comments directly challenge the United States' ideology and value system.
The CCP is denying the United States legitimacy. It's also denying the Western values represented by the United States. Put simply, what the Chinese leader wants to say is, the Western values of democracy and freedom are current, but the totalitarian system represented by the CCP and its values is what will lead the future.
He called the diplomat's statement a declaration of challenge toward Western values.
Basically, the CCP is openly declaring that it seeks to dominate the world and promote its system to the entire world in the future.
Tang explained that the aggressive speech also served another purpose, to test the Biden administration's bottom line. He says the speech pushed White House officials, looking to see how they'd respond in the face of Beijing's aggressive diplomacy. Juliet Song, NTD News.
A rare diplomatic flare-up between China and the European Union. Beijing has blacklisted a number of EU officials. The move appears to be retaliation for new European sanctions on China, imposed because of human rights abuses in Xinjiang. On Monday, the EU named 4 Chinese officials and 1 company that will be subject to the penalties. The sanctions were announced last week, but the affected entities weren't revealed at the time. The penalties include travel bans and having all EU-based assets frozen. As for the sanction list, it targets the director of the Xinjiang Public Security Bureau, 2 senior Chinese officials, and the former head of China's Xinjiang region. Alongside those 4, Xinjiang's Public Security Bureau for Production and Construction has also been sanctioned. Xinjiang's top official, Chen Quanguo, is not on the sanction list, but has been blacklisted by the U.S. Last year, the U.S. imposed sanctions on officials and companies over the regime's abuse of Uyghurs, an ethnic minority group. Unlike the U.S., the EU has sought to avoid confrontation with Beijing. But the latest move marks the first EU sanctions against Beijing since 1989. That action came in response to the Tiananmen Square massacre, when China's military opened fire on unarmed student protesters. All 27 EU countries agreed to the new sanctions, but Hungary called them harmful. China is EU's second largest trading partner after the U.S. Beijing is also a major investor in poorer countries across Central Europe. Beijing immediately responded to the sanctions announcement, levying its own sanctions on 10 EU officials and 4 entities. Among them is the EU's main decision-maker on foreign policy, known as the Political and Security Committee, and 2 leading think tanks. German politician Reinhard Bütikofer was among the most high-profile figures to be hit. He serves as chairman of the European Parliament's delegation to China. Beijing accused them of interfering in China's internal affairs. The sanctions restrict them from entering China or doing business with the country. Beijing also warned the EU against going down what it called the wrong path and urged it to correct its so-called mistake. In its first ever report on China policy strategy, Switzerland says it wants to create greater coherence with Communist China. It also indicates at the same time there are, quote, clear differences in values between the 2 countries. The Central European nation also emphasizes human rights abuses in Communist China. Beijing's embassy in Switzerland denounces the report in response, but Chinese media react differently. Last Friday, the Swiss foreign minister presented the country's China policy for 2021 to 2024. He says human rights dialogue and trade interests are the 2 key issues.
Human rights dialogue and at the same time Switzerland's 3rd most important trading partner. These 2 keywords have long characterized Switzerland's relationship with China.
Human rights dialogue between Switzerland and Communist China was suspended in 2018. Switzerland is now willing to continue the dialogue. The foreign minister says, quote, a difficult dialogue is better than no dialogue. He points out that Beijing's willingness to have the dialogue has dropped, while the human rights situation in China got worse. But Amnesty International's annual report suggests that the human rights situation in China has been worsening year after year. This is true even when the regime had human rights dialogues with Western countries. Another key area in the report is the economy. It includes the promotion of trade, investment, export, and tourism. This approach echoes the Swiss-China high-level meeting earlier this month. Switzerland's finance minister and the Chinese regime's vice premier met and agreed to deepen bilateral ties in stock market trading, asset management, and other areas. Both countries' central banks are also working on projects for digital money. Beijing's embassy in Switzerland responds to the new China policy by claiming that China has always attached great importance to human rights protection, and it criticizes Switzerland for, quote, sending a wrong signal to the outside world. But some Chinese media interpret Switzerland's strategy as something positive. China Business News says in an article that Switzerland prioritizes China in foreign policy. The article leaves out the part about different values, but adds an interview with the vice chairman of a Chinese business association in Switzerland. The vice chairman praises the Swiss-China Free Trade Agreement as being very good for China. Communist China is asserting its territorial claims in the South China Sea. It sent over 200 vessels into Philippines' claimed waters. The Philippine defense chief is demanding that the ships leave its Whitsun Reef. He says, quote, we call on the Chinese to stop this incursion and immediately recall these boats violating our maritime rights and encroaching into our sovereign territory. An international tribunal has rejected the CCP's claims in the South China Sea, but Beijing does not recognize this ruling. It claims the Whitsun Reef is its own, but on Saturday, a Filipino cross-government task force stated that the reef is well within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. The Chinese regime's foreign ministry then defends the ships there, saying that they were fishing vessels and they were using the reef to shelter from strong winds. They say Chinese ships regularly fish in these waters. But the Filipino defense minister reports that the ships were actually military manned. Chinese fishing vessels have been previously suspected of being used as maritime militias to assert Beijing's territorial claims. Critics have repeatedly called out the Filipino president's friendly ties with Beijing. In 2019, he defended his soft approach to CCP leader Xi Jinping, saying, quote, "When Xi says I will fish, who can prevent him?" The Pentagon's new number 2 official says the U.S. must think of China as its primary challenge. In her first remarks since being sworn in, Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks warned on Friday, quote, "Beijing has demonstrated increased military competence and a willingness to take risks." She pointed to China's adversarial measures in the Indo-Pacific region, while also noting China's mounting tensions with neighboring countries. China lays claim to over 90% of the South China Sea. Its sweeping territorial claims have been condemned internationally, and as of 2016, an international tribunal deemed them unlawful. The U.S. has also rejected its claims. Deputy Secretary Hicks' remarks mirrored some comments by U.S. officials during the recent Alaska meeting with China. She said China's military is becoming more capable and that it threatens international order. She says she plans to deter China by strengthening ties with allies and by investing in weapon systems. Hicks also revealed that the Pentagon had already predicted the threat back in 1997. Strategy papers projected that the U.S. would face a challenging China by 2015. The U.S. National Intelligence Council published its report on foreign interference in the 2020 U.S. elections. It shows the U.S. intelligence community is still at odds over whether China interfered in the election.
The official report concludes that China did not try to interfere with the U.S. election. It says it has high confidence in that judgment, though a minority view in the report contradicts that conclusion. The minority view says China tried to affect candidates' voter preferences and voting processes. It says China's actions meet the definition of election influence. The official report says China didn't care which U.S. candidate was elected. The minority view disagrees, saying China preferred an establishment candidate over Trump. China expert Gordon Chang tells the Epoch Times program American Thought Leaders that China wanted Biden.
Beijing believed it really did have a candidate in this race and worked very hard to unseat President Trump.
Citing one example, he says China created hundreds of thousands of fake social media accounts to influence the election. John Ratcliffe served as the director of national intelligence for Trump. He says China interfered in the 2020 election and that managers at the CIA pressured their analysts to draw a different conclusion. The official declassified report shows the conflicting views.
It's not a secret that high-ranking CCP officials enjoy special privileges in China, and that may be why some of their relatives think they can also benefit from these privileges. A video has gone viral recently on Chinese social media. A man surnamed Ying was seen forcing his way into the railway station of a town in East China's Jiangsu province. He went in without undergoing the mandatory security check, and after he was stopped, he insulted the workers. After police arrived, Ying is filmed saying to them, "I did it, so what? My brother is a high-ranking official. He is higher than you, and he is in charge of you." Ying also asked police, "Do you know the man surnamed Wu?" Local media reported that Ying is sentenced to 5 days in detention for disrupting public order. But media reports didn't mention who his brother is. This incident reminded people of something similar that happened in 2010. In a city south of Beijing, a speeding car hit 2 college students. One student later died in the hospital. The other suffered a fractured leg. After the incident, the 22-year-old drunk driver tried to escape the scene. When arrested, he shouted, "Sue me if you dare. My dad is Li Gang." Li Gang was the deputy director of the local public security bureau. The son appeared to believe his father's position could spare him from any punishments. Since then, the phrase, "My dad is Li Gang," went viral on Chinese internet. People started using it in an ironic way, in daily conversations, when they tried to avoid responsibility. Due to the public outcry to the incident, the father was unable to shield his son. The son was sentenced to 6 years in prison. The father also got removed from his position. A striking video is circulating through social media. It was captured during China's most important political conference of the year, the Chinese Communist Party's Two Sessions Conference earlier this month. In the clip, waitstaff in a conference hall are seen pouring tea for attendees, but their actions are perfectly synchronized. Moving as a unit, everything from pouring tea to moving their hands happens simultaneously, even as they take a collective step forward to serve the next seat. Social media users are comparing their movements to those of robots. What's more, most of the seats in the venue were vacant, but the staff paid no mind, pouring tea for each seat in turn, whether occupied or not. One netizen commented on the unusual sight, calling it the aesthetics of tyranny and totality, and likening it to slave-like synchronization. 8 pro-democracy activists arrived back home in Hong Kong after months in jail in mainland China, but now they're facing criminal charges and immediate detention.
8 pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong are now in police custody. That's after they returned to the city on Monday. 12 Hong Kong activists attempted to flee the city last August and head for Taiwan by boat. They were trying to escape charges brought by Beijing over the city's pro-democracy protests, but they were intercepted by Chinese officials on their way. The 8 who just returned to Hong Kong were among them. The activists were detained in China last year for alleged illegal border crossing. They were sentenced to between 7 months and 3 years in jail. Reuters reports that a van carrying one of the activists arrived at Tin Sui Wai police station on Monday morning. Pro-democracy activists have been fleeing Hong Kong since last summer as Beijing's new national security law increasingly limits freedom in the city.
China is buying more oil from both Iran and Venezuela. It's a test for Biden's foreign policies because it helps the two countries resist U.S. pressure. NTD's Patrick Hayden reports.
The Wall Street Journal reports China has increased its oil imports from Iran and Venezuela sharply, citing U.S. officials. One industry expert says in a period of constrained supply, China can get discounted oil on the black market from these countries.
If the oil's on the market, they'll buy it. Why would they care what the U.S. thinks? The U.S. and China are at a low point in their relationships. China can basically put the finger in the eye of the U.S. Secretary of State in Alaska, put the finger in the eye of the president, Joe Biden, and that's what they're doing, because they can. It's as simple as that.
Data company Plecker says China is expected to import over 900,000 barrels a day from Iran this month. That'd be the highest amount since the U.S. imposed an oil embargo against Iran 2 years ago.
The U.S. has lost any influence with respect to Iran or Venezuela over the last 20 years. This is not a new phenomenon. I don't lay this blame on Biden. I don't lay the blame on Trump.
He says over 20 years ago, Iran and Venezuela went their own way.
They have their own destiny in mind. They have their own principles and their own authoritarian prerogatives in mind, and that's what they will pursue.
He says there is no central trading information system to track oil trade.
So a lot of trading can happen, under the table, behind closed doors, where nobody knows it's happening. And then ships suddenly appear empty, fill up with oil in Iran or Venezuela, and then suddenly disappear, often with a name change or with turning off of the international navigation system.
Hofmeister says China views the U.S. as a declining empire, and the regime will do what it wants and only follow laws it deems appropriate for itself. He says the U.S. could send out ships to confiscate China's black market oil, but he warns that could create a heightened level of anxiety and international stress, which could have other consequences. Patrick Hayden, NTD News.
Campaigners are urging the UK government to ban fur imports from China after footage shows widespread animal abuse and disregard for health protocols. Warning, this piece may be disturbing for some viewers.
Investigators from Humane Society International, or HSI, visited 13 fur farms in China between November and December last year. They found evidence of animal abuse that breaches China's own regulations on animal housing and welfare. In response, campaigners want the UK to ban fur imports. In the photos and footage released, hundreds of foxes and raccoon dogs are tightly packed in dirty cages. On several farms, raccoon dogs were filmed repeatedly and randomly stabbed with a double-spiked electrocution device, which is meant to kill the animals instantly. HSI's veterinary advisor, Professor Alistair Macmillan, says, instead of instant death, they are likely to be immobilised by the electric shocks, but remain conscious and feel the intense pain of electrocution. A farmer admitted that the meat from slaughtered fur animals is sold to local restaurants for human consumption. HSI says, despite the investigation taking place during the pandemic, the Chinese farms routinely ignored disease control regulations. According to HSI, China is home to the largest fur-producing industry in the world, rearing 14 million foxes, 13.5 million raccoon dogs, and 11.6 million mink in 2019. A spokesperson from the British Fur Trade Association told British media The Guardian that there is no evidence or proof linking these farms to fur entering the UK supply chain. HSI says it has provided the investigation evidence to the Chinese authorities, both in Beijing and in London.
Huawei is likely to install its first production facility in France, despite the opposition of some officials and some among the public. The Chinese group managed to find an agreement at a political level. NTD's David Vives has more.
Around 150 demonstrators protested against Huawei in the French city of Strasbourg. The Chinese tech giant signed an agreement with French authorities to build a facility in the region. But the decision is met with opposition.
All major Chinese businesses are controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. This is something we know for sure. Welcoming Huawei is like allowing this regime to take a foot in France.
The mayor of Strasbourg said she is opposed to Huawei in a press release. For municipal councillor Marina Lafay, the arrival of Huawei is a very bad surprise.
We as elected officials won't tolerate it. We can't welcome those who trampled on human rights.
Banners denounced the spy activities from the CCP.
We have been informed there is a risk of influence coming from the CCP as well as spy activities.
France has 6 R&D Huawei sites, but this will be the first production facility ever built outside mainland China for the group. Strasbourg officials denied the CCP to build in the city, but in December 2020, the Chinese group signed an agreement with the regional council to be located in an industrial zone in the nearby town of Brumat. According to Senator André Gattolin, the case of Huawei installing a facility in the region shows how the CCP manages to influence officials and have a ground in Western countries. He says when some officials refuse a partnership, the CCP uses others' networks to get what it wants.
You see, the Strasbourg mayor refused Huawei, and the department officials were suspicious. But the partnership was made with the region.
Gattolin says he looked into the details of partnership between French officials. He says the Grand Est region, where Strasbourg is located, is one of the regions that has created the most ties with the CCP.
The predecessors of the regional council created bonds, such as twin towns with China, and also other mayors in the region and across France. This is a long-term strategy of the CCP. It has to create multiple partnerships again and again.
The construction of the facility is scheduled to start in 2022. David Vives, NTD News, Paris.
And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you tomorrow.